Last time, we went into the cults of fiction and mythology, the ones built by writers, game designers, and filmmakers who understood that the ancient cult, as a horror device, operates on a frequency that nothing else in the genre can match. You responded, and some of you had notes. Some of you said, and I heard you clearly, that you wanted something more. Not games, not films, not mythology built by screenwriters. You wanted the real thing. You wanted the cults that actually existed. The ones documented by historians, archaeologists, and in some cases, by the survivors. I want to apologize to those whose comments were deleted on my last video. I reacted out of tension, and that wasn't the right way to handle it. I appreciate the feedback, and I'm learning from it. So today, we are going historical. And I want to be upfront with you right now. What you are about to hear is not reconstructed. It is not dramatized beyond what the historical record supports. Every cult in this video is real. Every ritual we discuss was documented, and some of them are still operating in some form today. If that already has something moving in your chest, good. Subscribe before we start, because you are not going to want to miss what comes after this one. The series has only just begun. Let's go. I want you to picture this. You are a traveler in 19th century India. You have been on the road for 3 days. At a rest stop near the Ganges, you meet a group of merchants headed in the same direction. They are polite, they are charming, they share their food with you. One of them plays music around the fire. They laugh at the right moments. They seem, in every observable way, like exactly the kind of company you would want on a long and dangerous road. You trust them. Of course you do. They have given you every reason to. You will never reach your destination. The Thuggee, from the Sanskrit word sthaga, meaning concealer, were one of the most organized, most methodical, and most theologically complex criminal cults in documented human history. They operated across India from at least the 13th century. Some historical records suggest even earlier, a 7th century Chinese pilgrim named Huan Tsang wrote of encountering and escaping stranglers consecrated to Kali during his travels. The cult was finally suppressed by British colonial authorities in the 1830s after a campaign led by a British administrator named William Henry Sleeman, a man who spent years documenting confessions, methods and theologies of captured Thuggee members in extraordinary detail. What Sleeman uncovered changed everything that colonial authorities and later historians thought they understood about organized crime, religion, and devotion. Because the Thuggee were not simply murderers who happened to be religious, they were a hereditary priestly order whose sacred duty, whose act of worship, was the ritual strangulation of travelers in the name of the goddess Kali. The theology was this: Kali, the Dark Mother, the goddess of destruction and creation, had once battled a demon called Raktabija, a creature so powerful that every drop of his blood that touched the ground spawned another demon. Kali had her assistants strangle the duplicates before they could bleed. The Thuggee understood themselves as the continuation of those assistants, or children of Kali, created from her sweat, continuing her sacred work on the roads of India in every generation. The method was as precise as it was terrifying. The Thuggee operated in organized bands, each member assigned a specific role. Scouts, called inveiglers, positioned themselves at rest stops, markets, and travel points, gathering intelligence on wealthy travelers, where they were going, how much money they carried, how many people were in their party. A Thuggee band would then join the group gradually, introducing themselves over 1 or 2 days as fellow travelers headed to the same destination. They were trained for months, sometimes years, in the art of human connection, how to build trust, how to read a target's psychology, how to become indispensable. Now, once the victim's guard was completely down, often 3 or 4 days into the journey, the kill was executed at a pre-selected location known as a bela. These locations were chosen for their specific characteristics. Isolated, with soft soil for rapid burial, near a water source for the disposal of evidence. The killing method was the rumel, a yellow or white handkerchief knotted at one end, worn around the waist of every member. The strangling was performed by 2 or 3 members simultaneously. It produced no blood. It left no screams. The body would be buried in a pit prepared in advance, and the group would move on before dawn. The Thuggees' strictest religious law was the prohibition of bloodshed. Blood belonged to Kaylee. To spill it on the ground was sacrilege. The strangling wasn't a workaround. The strangling was the ritual, and it was the specific method Kaylee had demonstrated, the specific method she had blessed. Every killing was a sacrifice. Every victim was an offering. One member, a strangler named Burham, confessed to British investigators that he had personally performed 931 ritual killings over 40 years of active service. When asked if he experienced remorse, he replied, calmly, with complete sincerity, that no man should feel compunction in following his trade. Listen to that again, slowly. Not a psychopath's indifference, a professional's code, a priest's conviction. Membership was primarily hereditary, passed from father to son, beginning with observation at age 10 and first killing at 18. This is documented in British colonial court records, not speculation. Boys grew up watching their fathers work, then learning at their father's side, to then taking their place in the order as though inheriting a craft. The children of victims who were too young to be killed, because the Thuggee had specific rules about which categories of people could and could not be sacrificed, were sometimes taken in and raised within the Brotherhood. Children of the road, raised by the men who had orphaned them, becoming, in adulthood, the same. The most disturbing element of the Thuggee archive, and this is what Sleeman's documentation reveals in uncomfortable depth, is the normality. These were not outcasts. They had families, farms, trades, neighbors who did not know. A Thuggee band would finish a killing operation, bury the bodies, divide the offerings taken from the dead, and return to their villages in time for harvest season. Their wives cooked for them. Their children ran to meet them at the gate, and then, when the right season arrived again, they went back to the road. The 1979 Guinness Book of Records estimated the Thuggees' total victims at approximately 2 million across their operating period. More conservative modern scholarly estimates place the figure between 50,000 and 150,000. Even at the lowest estimate, this is the most sustained, most organized ritual murder operation in documented human history. And it operated invisibly for 6 centuries, because the most dangerous cult is not the one that looks dangerous. It is the one that looks like company. In March of every year, across the cities and temple complexes of the Aztec Empire, a 20-day festival began. Flowers were brought, music was played, while offerings of maize and jade were laid at the feet of altars. Processions moved through the streets with ceremony and pageantry and color. It looked, from a certain distance, like a spring celebration. And in the center of it all, performing the most sacred rituals of the festival, walked the priests, dressed in human skin. His name was Zip Totec, our Lord the Flayed One. He was one of the most important deities in the entire Aztec religious pantheon, god of vegetation, of spring, of the agricultural cycle, of renewal, of war, of goldsmiths, of the liberating force of change itself. His origin myth was the theological foundation of everything his priests did in his name. According to Aztec cosmology, Zipe Totec had, in the primordial time before the current world was formed, flayed himself alive. Not as self-destruction, no, as provision. He removed his own skin and offered it as food for humanity, mirroring the process of a maize seed shedding its outer husk before germinating, mirroring the snake that sheds its skin in order to grow. The outer skin was the old dying layer. beneath it was the new. Life did not emerge despite the removal of the skin. Life emerged because of it. This theology, ancient, internally coherent, rooted in a genuine observation of agricultural and biological cycles, produced one of the most viscerally disturbing ritual practices documented in the pre-Columbian world. The festival dedicated to Zayp Totec was called Tlacaxipahualistli. In the Nahuatl language, this translates directly as flaying of men. It took place annually on the spring equinox, before the onset of the rainy season. Its purpose was to ensure fertility, and rainfall, and a successful harvest. The lives of everyone in the city depended on this ritual. That theological weight, that absolute existential stakes, is critical to understanding how what happened in this festival was not perceived as violence. It was perceived as maintenance of the world. 40 days before the festival began, a male slave captured in war was selected in every ward of the city to represent the living God, to become, for 40 days, the earthly embodiment of Zayp Totec. He was dressed in the god's regalia. He was given offerings. He was honored. This was not cruelty dressed as ceremony. In the Aztec worldview, the man chosen was genuinely elevated. He was the god. He was sacred. He was, for 40 days, worshipped. On the day of the festival, the central ritual began. War captives were sacrificed, typically by the removal of the heart, the most sacred act in Aztec religious practice, the offering of the blood that fed the sun. Their bodies were then systematically flayed by specialist priests. The skins, still warm, dyed with yellow ochre, called Teocuitlacuamitl, meaning golden robes, were then worn by the priests of Zayp Totec over their bodies for the entire 20-day duration of the festival. Not for an hour, not for a day, for 20 days. As the days passed, the skins decayed. They rotted onto the bodies beneath. They stank. They changed color. They became something else entirely. And this was the point. The theology was exact. The priest wearing the skin was enacting the seed inside the husk. The decaying outer layer was the old vegetation dying away. When the skin was removed at the festival's end, when it was finally peeled off the priest's body and buried at the foot of the altar, it was an image of spring. New growth emerging from decay. Life pushing through what had died to make it possible. But the festival did not end with the flaying and the wearing. It ended with Tlahuahuanalitztli, the gladiatorial sacrifice. A warrior captured in battle, chosen for his exceptional courage and skill, was given a weapon. A wooden sword with its obsidian blades replaced with feathers. Mock weapons. He was then tethered to a large circular sacrificial stone, the Temalacatl, by a rope tied at his waist or ankle, limiting his movement. Against him were sent 5 of the most elite Aztec warriors, 2 jaguar warriors, 2 eagle warriors, and a 5th left-handed warrior. All fully armed, and with real weapons. The captive warrior fought. He was expected to fight with everything he had, and the record suggests that some of them, against all probability, managed to wound or incapacitate their opponents before the inevitable end. If a captive warrior somehow defeated all 5, something the historical record suggests happened at least once, he was granted his freedom and returned to his people with honor. If he lost, and he almost always lost, he was sacrificed, flayed, and his skin joined the ritual. In 2018, a first-of-its-kind archaeological discovery at the site of Untouched Tehuacan in the Mexican state of Puebla confirmed what texts and codices had described for centuries. Archaeologists from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History excavated the first known standing temple dedicated to Zayp Totec. Among the artifacts recovered, stone skulls, carved torsos, and the physical evidence of ritual flaying preserved in the stonework. It was not myth, it was architecture. What haunts this ritual, and the reason it belongs in any serious examination of real cult horror, is the complete absence of malice at its center. The priests of Zyp-Totec were not sadists. They were farmers' priests, spring priests. They were performing the ritual that, in their complete and internally consistent cosmological understanding, caused the rain to fall, the crops to grow, and the world to continue turning. They wore rotting human skin in the streets of their city for 20 days because they believed, with the same sincerity that any religious practitioner brings to their most sacred act, that the alternative was the end of everything. Why, that is not the horror of evil. That is the horror of faith taken to its absolute conclusion. There is a city in northern India called Varanasi. It sits on the west bank of the Ganges River, and it is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, possibly the oldest. It has been a place of pilgrimage for at least 3,000 years. Hindus come from across the world to bathe in the sacred waters of the Ganges and to perform funeral rites on the burning ghats, the wide stone steps where cremation fires have been burning, without interruption, for centuries. Many Hindus travel to Varanasi specifically to die there. The belief is that dying in Varanasi, in the presence of the Ganges, breaks the cycle of reincarnation. That death in this specific city, on these specific ghats, grants moksha, liberation, not the final release. And at the edge of those ghats, among the cremation fires, watching the processions of the dead arrive day and night without end, the Aghori are waiting. The Aghori are a sect of Hindu ascetics who have existed since at least the 5th century BCE and remain active today, primarily in northern India and Nepal. They are devotees of Shiva in his form as Bhairava, the destroyer, the annihilator, the god who dwells in the cremation ground, because the cremation ground is where reality is most clearly visible. Their philosophy, distilled to its essential form, is this: everything that exists is part of the divine. There is no separation between the sacred and the profane. The distinction between purity and pollution, the distinction that structures virtually every other religious tradition in the world, is, for the Aghori, the primary illusion that keeps human beings trapped in the cycle of death and rebirth. The path to liberation is not purification. The path to liberation is the complete, unflinching dissolution of the line between what you will and will not accept. And so the Aghori practice what they preach with a precision that makes most people physically recoil. They live in cremation grounds, sleeping among the ash and remains. They smear their bodies with the ash of cremated human corpses, ash gathered from the burning ghats, requested from the families of the dead, applied to every surface of the skin as a statement of theological position. I belong to death as much as to life. There is no difference. They use human skulls, kapala, as their eating and drinking vessels. They wear bone jewelry carved from human remains collected from the ghats. They practice post-mortem cannibalism. This is not metaphor. This is not symbolic. Photographer Tamara Marino spent a month living and working with the Aghori in 2016, documenting their practices. She watched. She documented. What she recorded confirms what historians and anthropologists have documented for centuries. The Aghori's most important ritual, called Shav Sadhana, or the practice of meditating on corpses, requires an Aghori to locate a human body, typically retrieved from the Ganges, meditate upon it through the night, and, as the culminating act of the ritual, consume flesh from it. The purpose, as the Aghori explain it with complete clarity, is to confront and dissolve the most fundamental human aversion. The disgust response, the flinching from decay, from death, from the consumed body, is in their theology the ego's most visceral defense mechanism, the one that most clearly marks the boundary between self and other, between living and dead, between what we consider ourselves to be and what we are actually made of. To eat the flesh of a corpse is, for the Agori, to say, I am not separate from this. There is no line here. The boundary your culture drew for you is a fiction. I know what I am. This is not the horror of cruelty. There is no victim in the Agori's practice, no murder, no assault, no violation of a living person's will. The dead do not consent, but neither do they suffer. The horror is philosophical. It is the confrontation with what every other religious tradition, every social contract, and every cultural framework across the entirety of human history has worked to prevent you from acknowledging that there is no clean line between the living body and the decaying one, that the flesh we call ourselves and the flesh we call remains are the same substance in different states. The Agori drink alcohol and smoke marijuana as part of their ritual practice, not as indulgence, but as dissolution of another set of distinctions: sobriety and intoxication, clarity and altered states. Some consume their own urine, some consume feces. Every aversion, systematically and deliberately confronted and consumed. Many rural Indian communities simultaneously fear and revere the Agori. Their blessings are widely sought after. Their ash, the ash they carry from the cremation grounds, is believed to carry extraordinary healing power. Some Agori gurus command deep reverence across entire regions. The most disturbing thing about the Agori is not what they do. It is the internal consistency of why they do it. Their theology is not incoherent. It is not mad. It is one of the most rigorously logical approaches to religious practice in the entire history of human spirituality. If you accept its premises, that separation is illusion, that the divine contains everything without exception, then everything the Agori do follows with a precision that is, in its own way, beautiful. The horror is that they might be right. And the question that stays with you, if you let it, is this: what exactly are you afraid of touching? And why do you believe that fear is wisdom? In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate did something that no governing body of Rome had done before or would do again for nearly a century. They executed approximately 7,000 of their own citizens. Not on the battlefield, not for treason in the military sense, not even for a crime with a single identifiable victim. They executed 7,000 people for attending the wrong religious ceremony. The Bacchanalia, the mystery rites of Bacchus, the Roman name for Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, ecstasy, transgression, and the dissolution of boundaries, had been growing quietly beneath the surface of Roman society for at least a generation. Their origin was a Greek priestess. Livy, writing approximately 200 years after the events, names her Pacula Ania of Campania, who had transformed the rites from a daytime women-only ceremony, conducted a handful of times per year, into a nighttime initiation open to men and women, conducted 5 times per month, and, according to the accounts that reached the Senate, involving experiences of extraordinary intensity that no official Roman religion could offer. The rites were initiatory mysteries in the Greek tradition, meaning that what happened inside them was absolutely secret, known only to initiates. The Bacchic mysteries had ancient Greek and Phrygian roots. Dionysus was a god who had arrived from outside the Greek pantheon, absorbed from Asia Minor, and his mysteries carried that foreignness into Rome alongside the Greek cultural imports that were already making Roman conservatives deeply uncomfortable. What Livy's account, the most detailed record we have, describes inside those ceremonies is this: nocturnal initiations, ecstatic states, the dissolution of social hierarchy, slaves, freed persons, women, men, young and old, all equal inside the rites, all equal before the god, and allegedly sexual violence used as initiation rite, murder to silence those who refused, a network so extensive that initiates held positions across the military, the magistracy, the Senate itself. Modern scholars are careful with Livy's account. He wrote 2 centuries after the events, had political motivations for emphasizing the Senate's righteousness, and was working with sources that themselves had every reason to exaggerate. The sexual violence and murder allegations are likely propaganda, the Roman Senate's version of the kind of moral panic that powerful institutions deploy when they want to destroy something that threatens their authority without engaging it directly. But here is what is not disputed, because it survives on stone. The Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, the Senate's decree against the cult, preserved on a bronze tablet discovered in Calabria in 1640, is the oldest surviving document of systematic religious persecution in European history. And what it reveals is this: the Senate's actual terror had nothing to do with the specific accusations of violence and depravity. The real threat was that the Bacchanalian network was operating entirely outside of Senate authority. It had membership across every class of Roman society: senators' wives, their sons, freedmen, slaves. It had its own hierarchy, its own priests, its own initiation rites that created bonds of absolute loyalty that could not be overridden by civic obligation. It had been growing for years in the dark, and when the Senate finally learned its true scale, what they saw was not a religious group. What they saw was a parallel state. The Senate's response was immediate and total. Investigators were appointed. Rewards were offered to informants. The names of cult members were compiled from confessions, and then from the names of those confessed, and then from those names, a chain of exposure that spiraled outward until it had netted, according to Livy, 7,000 people. Most were executed, but some died before their trials. Mass suicides in prison cells recorded in the historical documents. The decree that followed banned the Bacchanalia across all of Roman Italy. Any gathering of more than 2 men and 3 women was prohibited. Any cult ceremony required prior approval from the Senate of Rome specifically. Any violation of these terms carried the death penalty. The first systematic state suppression of religion in the Western world. And it was directed not at a murderous or violent group, but at one that had simply grown large enough, hidden enough, and loyal enough to its own hierarchy to be perceived as a threat to the state's total authority over the inner lives of its citizens. What does that tell you about which cults governments are actually afraid of? Not the violent ones, not the ones that hurt people. The historical record is clear. Rome tolerated extraordinary religious diversity, including practices that would horrify modern sensibilities. What Rome could not tolerate was a cult whose loyalty to its god was stronger than its loyalty to Rome. That is the specific fear. That is always the specific fear. And recognizing it tells you something uncomfortable about the relationship between every government that has ever existed and the interior lives of the people it governs. In 1090 CE, a man named Hassan-i-Sabah climbed a mountain in northern Persia, entered a fortress called Alamut, the Eagle's Nest, and declared it the center of a new world. He would live in that fortress for the rest of his life, 35 years, and in that time, he would never once leave it. He would, in those 35 years, order the deaths of caliphs, sultans, crusader lords, and viziers across the entire breadth of the medieval world. And the men he sent to do it would walk into the courts of the most powerful rulers alive in plain sight, unarmed, and kill them with their bare hands, knowing that they would not survive the attempt, and going anyway. Hassan-i-Sabah was a brilliant Ismaili Muslim theologian and strategist who, after being driven out of the Fatimid court in Cairo during a power struggle, decided that the conventional tools of political power, armies, money, alliances, were tools for people who didn't understand power clearly enough. He understood something different. He understood that the most effective political weapon was not the destruction of an enemy's army. It was the demonstrated certainty that no matter how many guards stood between a ruler and death, the ruler was not safe. The group he founded at Alamut was known in Arabic as the Nizari Ismailis. To their Sunni enemies, and to the Crusaders who encountered them, they became known by a term that has entered dozens of modern languages, Hashashin, from which we derive the English word assassin. The exact etymology is disputed. The most dramatic explanation, that the name came from hashish and that Hassan Isaba's operatives were drug-induced into their missions, was popularized by Marco Polo's account of the Old Man of the Mountain, who maintained a paradise garden where initiates were taken, drugged into ecstasy, shown what heaven felt like, and then told they could return permanently only if they completed their mission and died in its execution. Modern historians are skeptical of the hashish story. The Arabic word hashishi was used as an insult by Sunni opponents, likely meaning something closer to rabble or low-class fanatics, not a literal description of drug use. But what is not disputed, what is documented in Arabic chronicles, Persian records, Crusader accounts, and the administrative records of the various states the assassins targeted, is the method itself and its extraordinary effectiveness. Hassan Isaba's operatives were called fida'i, those who sacrificed themselves. They were recruited young, trained over years in theology, languages, customs, and the ability to pass completely undetected in enemy courts. A fida'i might spend years embedded in a target's court, as a servant, a merchant, a scholar, building trust, learning the routines of the target, identifying the specific moment and method of maximum effectiveness. And then they would act. In public, in daylight, without weapons, using only what they could take from the environment in the moment. The strategy was deliberate in its visibility. Hassan Isaba understood that a secret murder looked like bad luck or coincidence. A public assassination, committed in the court of a sultan by a man who had been trusted and never detected, sent a message that could not be rationalized away. No one is safe. Anywhere. Ever. The political effect was out of all proportion to the numbers involved. The Nizari Ismaili community numbered perhaps a few tens of thousands, a tiny minority surrounded by far more powerful enemies. But for nearly 2 centuries, caliphs trembled at Alamut's letters. One of the most famous documented operations, the assassination of Nizam al-Mulk, the Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire, in 1092, the same year Hassan Isaba took Alamut. A fida'i approached al-Mulk disguised as a supplicant, seeking alms, and drove a dagger into him in the midst of his own court. This killing is considered by historians to have significantly accelerated the fragmentation of the Seljuk Empire. Another. In 1192, the assassins killed Conrad of Montferrat, the newly elected king of Jerusalem, in the street of Tyre. 2 fida'i, disguised as Christian monks, had been living in Tyre for months, embedded in the community, unawaiting. The theological dimension of all of this is what transforms the assassins from a political operation into a cult in the deepest sense of the word. Hassan Isaba's theology included a concept called ta'lim, the doctrine that ultimate religious truth could only be transmitted through an imam, a divinely appointed teacher, and that the imam's authority superseded all external religious law. This gave the Nizari Ismaili community a theological framework in which obedience to the imam, obedience to Hassan Isaba, was not a political submission, but a religious one, the highest possible devotion. The fida'i did not kill for political power in any worldly sense. They killed because their imam had determined that this killing served the divine, and they walked into enemy courts and died because the imam's word and the divine will were to their complete and settled certainty the same thing. The assassins were finally destroyed in 1256 when the Mongol army of Hulagu Khan, who methodically leveled everything in its path without theological consideration, dismantled the mountain fortresses one by one, and burned the great library of Alamut, which Hassan-i-Saba had spent decades building. It contained, by historical accounts, an extraordinary collection of scientific, mathematical, and astronomical manuscripts, one of the great libraries of the medieval world, gone in a single afternoon. What remained was the word: assassin. In every major European language, a single cult's operational method, preserved in the vocabulary of the world they frightened for 200 years. That is the specific kind of permanence that only real history produces. A word you use without knowing it carries a mountain fortress inside it. The memory of a man who never left his room and never stopped reaching. 5 cults, all real, all documented, all gone in some form, though not all of them are as gone as you might hope. The Thuggee are suppressed. The Temple of Zyptotec is an excavation site. The Bacchanalia was legally dismantled 22 centuries ago. The Assassins' mountain fortresses are tourist destinations now, their library ash scattered somewhere in the Mongolian wind. But the Aghori are in Varanasi tonight, sitting at the edge of the Ganges, tending their fires, practicing what they have practiced since the 5th century BCE. Completely legal, completely documented, completely unchanged. Well, what connects all 5 of these is something I want you to sit with before you close this video and go back to your evening. Every single one of these cults, the Thuggee, the priests of Zyptotec, the Aghori, the Bacchants, the Assassins, operated with complete theological sincerity. There was not a single member of any of these groups in any period of their documented history who believed they were doing something wrong. The Thuggee believed they were completing the sacred work Kali demonstrated in the primordial cosmos. The priests of Zyptotec believed they were maintaining the conditions for the world to continue. The Aghori believe, in the present tense, that they are pursuing the most honest engagement with reality available to a human being. The Bacchants believed they were being called into the presence of a god who saw them more fully than any official religion ever had. The Fidai believed they were acting under divine instruction, transmitted through an imam who could not be wrong. None of them were confused about what they were doing. None of them had been deceived about their purpose. None of them needed to be manipulated into it. They chose it, clearly, with open eyes, because the framework through which they understood reality made their actions not just acceptable, but obligatory. Not just permitted, but sacred. And that, more than any specific ritual, more than any specific method of death or devotion, is the most genuinely disturbing thing that history's real cults have to tell us. Certainty is not safety. Sincerity is not proof. A person can be completely or irreversibly, theologically certain about something that will leave dozens or hundreds of thousands of people dead in the soft earth beside roads that no one remembers. History didn't bury these cults because they were ineffective. It buried them because they worked exactly as intended. And the question that stays with me, preparing videos like this one, is simple. How many of the systems we are currently embedded in will look from 200 years out the way these look to us now? Think about that before you sleep tonight. And if this video did something to you, subscribe, hit the bell, share it with someone who needs to be unsettled, because next time we go somewhere even the historians don't like to look.